Morning, everyone. Give me 1 second here. Make a couple of changes behind the scenes. That's a little better. Excellent. All right. Well, welcome everyone to our virtual tour as part of our 5th annual and first virtual March 4th. I'm Jonathan Haupt, the Executive Director of our nonprofit Pat Conroy Literary Center. Happy Sunday to you too, Melissa. Let me make a couple of notes about our technology here while I'm filling a minute or two while we wait for some other folks to join. I'm going to give the tour on an iPad, which means right now y'all are looking at me, but the magic of iPad technology lets me flip the camera around. So during most of the tour, I will see what you see. Right now, I can see a few of you saying hello in the chat, which I can see and you can't see. Once the tour is underway, I probably won't actually be able to see your comments in the chat that often. But when we get to the end of the tour, we'll try and save some time then to answer your questions, and I'll happily have a look at what has popped up in the chat again at that point. Let me make one other plug here for something that's going to happen at 2 o'clock, which I think most of you are planning on attending anyway, but if you're on the fence, this may be a tipping point for you. Very happy to announce that Cassandra King Conroy, the honorary chair of our Conroy Center board and the Queen Mother of the Conroy Center, will be making an on-camera appearance to give a brief welcome and some opening remarks for our 2 o'clock session, which will feature Drew Lanham, a guy who just blows us away every year that he participates in March 4th. And this will be his 4th appearance. 4 out of 5 years Drew's been a part of this, appearing this year with his own mentor and my dear friend, John Lane, in conversation with Ellen Malfris, who's of course very dear to us here in the Low Country. But Cassandra will be joining that session as well to make some opening comments on behalf of March 4th and our Conroy Center. So with that said, I think we've got a nice, good, solid number of folks out there. So let's get underway a little bit here, shall we? I am in the brand new Conroy Center, 601 Bladen Street, a location that we have occupied for all of a week and a half. And yet this is the 3rd virtual tour I've given of the new space. That's how popular these virtual tours have become for the Conroy Center during this time of pandemic, when it's not as easy for folks to get out and visit us in person. This has become a wonderful alternative. I did a quick count this morning, in part because I was curious. How many of these virtual tours have I given, of course, at the old location? This is somewhere between number 18 and number 20, and they began in April. So that's, about a year of doing them, and it's been fantastic. It's allowed people, not just from all over the country, but from all over the world to visit the Conroy Center. The first time we had a virtual tour participant from France, from Paris, in fact, well, we're always going to have to find a way to do this now that we have people around the world who are deeply invested in Mr. Conroy's legacy, who are able to not only take the tour, but participate in so many of our programs. We don't ever want to lose that. So the virtual programs have become very special to us. And today you're going to get to go on a tour and see our center as it looks right now through the lens of this camera, which is a wonderful experience. I don't want to take anything away from that, but it's not quite equivalent to being here in person. I will certainly tell you that as well. I want to say a couple thank yous before we start wandering around our center here, because this place has come together so quickly, so beautifully. And that's not the work of any one person, certainly not the work of me. So I want to thank a couple of people who have really given remarkable amounts of time and energy and support to make this happen. And many of them are out there in Zoom land with us right now. This morning, I see Marley Rusoff has signed on from our board of directors. Marley is a fundraising dynamo and had a vision not only for this building, but for the center and the grand scale as well. And you will see her work reflected in everything that we do. I believe Cassandra King Conroy is out there as well. Pat's sister, Kathy Conroy Harvey, has been absolutely instrumental to the move, to getting things set up in this new location, in part with our friend Elaine Scott, who has made possible all of the beautiful wall hangings that you will see. Elaine just has such a clear vision of where things can go and how to curate visual space. She's been fantastic. Marilyn Harcharak, who's been sort of our project manager for the renovation of this building, I believe is with us this morning. She's been signing on to quite a few of the March 4th events. And I want to thank a great big group of our volunteers and our local authors and our local instructors who have been giving their time and their energy to all of this as well. More than we can name this morning, but y'all have been just incredibly generous to make this happen so very quickly. And I'm excited for you now to get to see what we're going to do. So I am standing here in our reception area. There's a full wall mural behind me done by a local artist, Japanese born, but now makes his home here in Beaufort. His name's Aki Kato. And I'll show you a couple of Aki's pieces as we get going. This backdrop, you may recognize, you may have seen it a couple of times during March 4th already. And if you were with us 2 Thursdays ago, not last Thursday, but the Thursday before that, as part of our largest Zoom event ever, you saw Conroy Center student intern Holland Perryman and me in front of this as we interviewed #1 New York Times bestselling author Sarah Shepard and her own teenage co-author Lilia Buckingham. That was a remarkable event for all of us, and the backdrop was beautiful for that. You'll see a wider shot as I wander about the room here in just a second. As part of the director's version of the tour, it's fun to share a couple of things with you that are not actually on display here in the Conroy Center. And I want to do that at the start to make this a little more special for us. I'll do that through screen share. And this also lets me tell a story that kind of puts my own relationship with Pat Conroy in context. So let me share this with you. And whoops, that's not it. Technology. There it is. So let's do that one first. There he is. That's probably a face familiar to most of you out there in Zoom land. This is our guy, Pat Conroy, born October 26, 1945, passed away March 4th of 2016, 5 years ago. The author of 12 books, 11 published during his lifetime. The 12th, The Low Country Heart, came out after he passed away. 4 of those books were made into major motion pictures. Of course, those are The Water is Wide, released as the film Conrack, and then later Hallmark Hall of Fame's Water is Wide. The Great Santini, which is filmed primarily right here in Beaufort. And you'll see a couple of pieces of movie memorabilia on the course of the tour. The Lords of Discipline and The Prince of Tides, also filmed primarily here in Beaufort, and also with a few pieces of corresponding memorabilia on display. Pat looked very much like that photo there. When I came to know him, I was originally hired to be a publicist, a marketing person for the University of South Carolina Press, the book publisher in the USC campus in Columbia. And I was for a long time, one of hundreds, potentially thousands of people who had some sort of limited access to Pat Conroy to ask him for things, for endorsements or appearances. And occasionally he'd say yes, and mostly he'd say no, because so many people asked him for so many things, it just wasn't possible to say yes to all of them. But over time, as I came to know Pat, he became very interested in me and ultimately became a magnificent mentor to me. And I want to share with you a letter of recommendation that Pat wrote for me when I went from being a marketing person at USC Press to becoming a publisher. And this is a letter that, well, it reflects well on me, certainly, but mostly it reflects well on Pat. There's a lovely photo of us. Let me enlarge this so we can all see it together. And this will be the last thing I show you in this room before we begin our tour. So this is Pat Conroy writing a letter of support for me to be director of the University of South Carolina Press. My name is Pat Conroy and I'm a South Carolina writer. That, by the way, gang, is a completely unnecessary sentence because everyone knew that, but this is how humble Pat was. I've got 4 brothers and a sister who are Gamecocks and consider me a much lesser man because I'm only a Citadel Bulldog. I'm writing this letter in support, to ridiculously enthusiastic support of Jonathan Haupt for the full-time director, South Carolina University Press position. Though I do not have to tell you this, Dr. Lynn, I believe the South Carolina Press represents the cultural heartbeat of the state. I have a long and fruitful association with it, and Jonathan Haupt recently got me to write an introduction to State of the Heart, a group of personal essays by South Carolina writers edited by Aida Rogers. The amazing thing about this fact is that Jonathan Haupt has never passed a single nickel or dime from his hand to mine. He gets me to do things with his professionalism, his complete charm, and the love of the work he does. He understands his role as a caretaker of the South Carolina experience, and he causes me to think about it as he entices me in his cobra-like fashion whenever he explains what new favor I can do for him. If he gets this job, I would like you to demand he never ask a single thing of me again. But I admire his passion and dedication for his job and his enormous dedication to getting it done right. I was once a student of the great James Dickey on your campus. It was in that class that I learned of the central importance of the South Carolina press. I think Jonathan Haupt is the best thing that ever happened to the press. I urge you and your committee to support him and get him off my back. Very sincerely yours, Pat Conroy. That's very much what it was like to be a friend of Pat Conroy, to be championed. But more than that, that letter was a lesson to me at a time when I needed a lesson like that. Pat taught me that you write a letter like that, you're writing it for the person it's about and not for the benefit of the person it's to. It was Pat's way of showing me his faith in me, showing me the person he thought I could become. And in many ways, I'm still trying to become the person that Pat described in that letter. And now that I get to mentor others, I do it in the very same spirit that Pat once mentored me. And that ultimately is the spirit of this center, to teach in the way that Pat taught us with his great spirit of generosity. So that said, I'm going to flip the camera around and show you some artifacts that help explain how Pat Conroy became the kind of guy who would write that letter for me and wrote very similar letters and gave wonderful support to so many of us out there. So let's begin our tour, gang. Here we go. So here's the reverse shot. And apologies if you get motion sickness. Let me flip this around so you can see Aki's beautiful mural back there behind our welcome station. There's a smaller piece he's done over here too, Tale of Carolina Snowball, which is a character I'm sure you all remember from Prince of Tides. But if we go this way, back toward what is our main entrance, I want to show you a brand new piece that was just assembled and installed 2 days ago. This is our children's reading book, and there's Melissa Conroy's Poppy's Pants and one of her dolls right there for us. So this is a wonderful gift made possible by one of the many people who've given so generously to support the creation of our center and its renovations. And it was assembled, incidentally, a couple days ago by Dana Ridenau, our local author. Oh, look at that. Somebody left copies of her books right there. I wonder who might have done that. So many thanks to Dana and to her husband, Bill, for putting that together. We look forward to sharing that with a lot of kids. We're going to come back to this room in just a second, so I won't tell you too much about what's in here, but I definitely want you all to see this view. This is a look out our front door. Oh, you're welcome, Dana. I did see that. Out toward the Beaufort River, which you can see right there. We're actually looking at the backside of what was a county courthouse that has a couple of connections to Mr. Conroy, and that is Bay Street, one of our main thoroughfares right there as well. You can see a couple of cars driving down that. That is a pretty impressive view right there. This is the world that Pat Conroy described. This is Beaufort alive, unfolding right in front of us. So it's a really remarkable location to be at. Those of you who are deeply familiar with the Prince of Tides may remember that the version of Bay Street that Pat writes about is called the Street of Tides. And he describes a stretch of the Street of Tides where there's a courthouse, a school, and I think it's 11 antebellum homes or stately homes, whatever word he would have used to describe them. That's this. That's the courthouse. The school is just down to my right, and those homes are just down to my right as well. So we are right here in the heart of the world that Pat described in the Prince of Tides. We're going to start of our quick tour of this gallery space in this room, where most of the material relates to the Conroy family. This is a beautiful quilt made by Pat's sister, Kathy Conroy, one of our board members and one of our docents as well. Kathy made this with her teacher, her own mentor, Brenda Wagner, as a 70th birthday present for Pat. And Pat actually used it during the last months of his life. So it is the beautiful centerpiece to this room. Let me go over here, show you a photo of all of the family, including Pat and Kathy. Let's see if we can get that glare out of the way. There they are. So that's Pat in the back. This is a photo taken in 1968. Pat would have been 23 at the time, just finishing his first year as a teacher. surrounded there by his 6 siblings. That's Kathy in the blue next to him. Pat's other sister, Carol Ann, in the orange coat. Brothers Mike and Jim in the back row. Brothers Tim and Tom in the front row. And of course, Pat's parents, Don Conroy and Peg Conroy up front there. Pat was a product of this family and wrote about it at length, of course. Let me tell you a little bit about Pat's mother. I've introduced her to you as Peggy Conroy, but that's not the name she was born with. She was born Frances Margaret Peake and grew up in the backwoods, beyond the backwoods, without much access to public education. But she found her way quickly to books, and this room is filled with books because it's Peggy who instilled that great love of reading in Pat. There was one book that was particularly transformative to her, and it is this book, which I'm sure familiar to many of you, Gone with the Wind, Margaret Mitchell. Peggy changed her own middle name to Margaret and went by Peg or Peggy her whole life in honor of this book and its author. She read this book to Pat when he was about 5 years old. Incidentally, Gone with the Wind is not age-appropriate reading for a 5-year-old, but that didn't stop Peggy. She was just blown away by the story in this book and wanted to share it with Pat. She read it in a way in which she could equate every single character in this book, and there are close to 100 if we count everybody, with someone real in the Conroy family life. So at a very young age, Pat Conroy was learning there was this connection between art and life, that the world of literature and the world of experiences were intertwined stories. There's another shot of Peggy with Jimmy Carter, governor at the time this was taken, later president, of course. They're at the movie premiere for Conrack, the film based on Pat's book, The Water is Wide. There's another photo down here of Peg surrounded by the whole family. There's Pat, many of his siblings, children as well. And here's a more recent photo of some of our Conroy siblings there with Pat. This is at Pat's 70th birthday party here in Beaufort in October of 2015. So let's get to the Colonel then, since we've spent a little time with Peggy. Don Conroy was one of the most highly decorated Marine aviators of his generation. He served with distinction in World War II in Korea as a member of the Black Sheep Squadron, and then did 2 tours of duty in Vietnam. Here we can see Don and all of his many medals as well. But he was a guy who could not leave the battle on the battlefield. He was physically and verbally abusive to a whole family, and Pat got the worst of it. Pat decided to tell the truth about that in his first novel, The Great Santini. And if you remember in that book, or if you've ever seen the cover of it, let's go right down there and have a look at that. You know, there's a big moment when Bull Meacham, the character based on Pat's dad, wakes up his son, Ben Meacham, character based on Pat, and gives him a leather jacket, a bomber jacket, on just after midnight on Ben's 18th birthday, sort of indoctrinating him into manhood. This is the Colonel's real Vietnam era flight jacket on display here at the Conroy Center. It was captured on the cover of the book, The Great Santini, by the artist Wendell Miner, who actually did one edition of the covers for all of Pat's books, at least one edition, with the exception of The Boo, Pat's very first book. Well, let me tell you a little bit about the Colonel's reaction to reading the truth of the story, of his family story, made so public in The Great Santini. And we can do that in his own words, because we have here on display a letter that the Colonel wrote to the Magnificent Seven, as it says, meaning Pat and his 6 siblings, after reading the novel, The Great Santini. At no point in this letter does Don Conroy admit that he was abusive to his family or apologize for that, but it begins a transformation for him. And I'll read just 2 paragraphs, given where we are on the clock right now. You find this one right here. In all honesty, I read the first 100 pages and I was furious. At page 222, not that the page is important, I was livid and put the book down. When I resumed reading, it came easier for me. And now that I look back, the writer had me, and many readers will feel much the same, in the palm of his hand. I laughed at some scenes, cried at others, figuratively speaking, of course, and came away a better person having lived with the Meachams. Let's skip down to the last paragraph here. To Pat, my eldest son, may you forever wear the cloak of authority as befitting the eldest Conroy, as a sign to all of our pride in you as a son and brother. This letter appears in full in this book, death of Santini, which I know many of you out there are also familiar with as well. And it began what Pat always referred to as his father's remarkable second act. In many ways, just to prove Pat wrong, Don Conroy started to become the kindest father and grandfather and uncle and friend he could be. And Pat was able to enjoy a really wonderful friendship with his dad. They would go to book signings together and sign copies of the great Santini and compete to see who would have the longer signing line. And Don would always sign copies. I hope you enjoy my son's work of fiction. And then he'd underline the word fiction a couple of times. And we have a couple of copies in the back that are signed that way. But he came to embrace a kind of literary celebrity. And here's a wonderful photo of Don holding a copy of the book in full great Santini mode. And here is a fun photograph put together, pre-Photoshop, of course, of the real great Santini, and then Robert Duvall, the actor, playing the role as well. So Pat told the truth about his dad, and it gave his dad a chance to change. It gave him a chance to try to redeem himself as best he could. And what could any writer hope for if not something like that? And it happened to Pat multiple times. If we think about his writing career, he told the truth about his father, and his father changed. He told the truth about education by way of The Water is Wide, and education started to change. He told the truth about the Citadel and Lords of Discipline, and the Citadel started to change. What a wonderful legacy for any writer to have written and published multiple books that actually transformed some part of the world. That's incredible in itself. We flip that back around for you. Our wall of great Santini continues right there with some wonderful lobby cards from the film. Again, this was shot primarily right here in Beaufort at a home called Untitled Home, which you can see right there, not far from where we are here at the Conroy Center. We also have a lot of Pat's medals in this room. And I mentioned the Prince of Tides. So let's go over here and look at this quickly before we go to our next room. This is a film jacket from one of the production crew on display here with a couple of movie house lobby cards from that film as well. Out here, this is a room that's dedicated to a period of about 12 years of Pat's life. Pat Conroy as student and teacher. And they're the 12 years that I think make Pat Conroy the man that he will ultimately become. Incredibly important series of years. Conroy's come here to Beaufort, South Carolina in 1961. It's the 23rd time the family has moved since Pat has been born. He's 16 years old. Beaufort High School is the 10th school he will go to. That was the military brat lifestyle that Pat grew up in. And there he is as a Beaufort High School junior and senior. Pat had always been the shy, awkward, kind of forgettable kid until this point because he'd been moved around so much. And he's growing up as a child of abuse with this secret hanging over him. So he hadn't really formed many friendships, hadn't really caught the attention of many teachers. All of that changes at Beaufort High School. In the span of 2 years, Pat becomes best all around, Mr. Congeniality, senior class president, captain and MVP of the basketball team. He's in the National Honor Society. He's playing other sports as well, and he's writing for the literary magazine. Beaufort High School makes all of that possible for Pat. It's hard to imagine who he might have become in the absence of the students and teachers at the school because they are transformative to him. I want to quickly mention 3 of those teachers, and we're looking at one of them right now, that good-looking guy behind the podium over there. That is Gene Norris. That was Pat Conroy's junior year English teacher and really a lifelong friend and mentor to Pat. Pat wrote quite a bit about Mr. Norris. Gene was the first person who gave Pat insight into the possibility that Pat himself might want to grow up to become a teacher, which of course he does. Gene also believed wholeheartedly that Pat Conroy would become a writer, and he gave him a couple of opportunities to explore that. Let's go over here, and we can tell that story a little more visually. When Pat came to Beaufort, he found a friend very quickly, a young man named Randy Randall, who was the son of the school superintendent and was in many ways everything that Pat Conroy wanted to be, but was not yet. Randy was tall and handsome and popular and smart and funny, really everything that Pat sort of hoped he would become in time. And Pat was really drawn to Randy. Then something very tragic happened for Pat, for the whole town, really. Randy Randall died in front of the whole school on the pitcher's mound, opening game of the 1962 baseball season at Beaufort High School. If you were with us yesterday, you may have noticed Bakari Sellers told a very similar story of having a young friend die. And Bakari said that that was the moment in his childhood when he started to realize that, when he started to lose the sense of invulnerability that children have. It was a very similar experience for Pat, but amplified in some ways, because Pat thought he was in mortal danger all the time as the child of abuse. So to see a young person, to see a teenage boy and his best friend at that die in front of him was transformative, was a heart condition in Randy's case, something undiagnosed. But the school didn't really know how to respond. The students didn't. And it was Jean Norris, Pat's English teacher, who gave them permission to mourn. Pat's mourning took the form of this poem, which I will show you in Pat's own handwriting and read for you. Pat wrote this to Randy Randall. That's who it's titled and addressed to, but ultimately this was a gift for Randy's parents, Morgan and Julia Randall, who became sort of a second set of surrogate parents, if you will, to Pat. I'll read it to you. I have ceased to wonder at the rapid flight of days. The slice of birds and winter shout are but an effort meant to render nature praise. Myself, I wish to think about 100 friends who walk a pathless street alone, in search of lost and youth-grieved dreams. Once a boy, fluid-limbed and not quite fully grown, gave love to life, and life, it seemed, surfeited with a honey tooth of perfect joy. Yet darkness lit another place, far off in the hills, so shadow wrapped the boy in death, and pressed his guiltless face with the flawless pages of eternal rhyme, the snow-fleeced lamb of earth and God-bound child of time. It's a beautiful poem, very much inspired by Thomas Wolfe. Pat was enamored with the writing of Mr. Wolfe at that point and really throughout his life, but you can see a lot of that reflected in those lines there. Once that poem came out of Pat Conroy, many others followed. And thankfully, Beaufort High had an outlet for that, Breakers Literary Magazine. So Pat Conroy was published for the first time as a 16, 17-year-old kid in Breakers Literary Magazine, Beaufort High School, an experience that meant so much to him that his senior year, he joined the editorial staff of Breakers. So at 17 years old, Pat Conroy decided he was going to be a writer who helped other writers. And that's the whole arc of the rest of his life. It begins because of Beaufort High School, it begins in part because of Jean Norris. Jean introduced Pat to the first living writers that the young Conroy ever met. That's a really wonderful gift to give to a young person. I've gotten to do that for many students at Beaufort High School as well. I want to quickly show you one of them and tell you a story about that. And let's see if we can do this. Because Jean Norris introduced Pat Conroy not just to any writer, but to the most famous writer in South Carolina at that time. This is Archibald Rutledge, who was South Carolina's first poet laureate and easily the most famous writer in South Carolina when Pat was a teenager. Jean took Pat to meet Archibald Rutledge, and Mr. Rutledge, who must have been 83 years old at the time, spent a whole afternoon with Pat, walking him around his ancestral home, which we see behind him there, Hampton Plantation, which is now a state park, and teaching Pat a lot about the craft of writing and the importance of knowing the stories behind the stories, knowing the proper names of things, spending time and attention in details. All of that was very much true of Mr. Rutledge's writing, and he tried to instill it in Pat Conroy in the afternoon they had together. Rutledge also took Pat into his writing room, which is the room we see Rutledge seated in there, showed him an unfinished poem, something Rutledge was writing. And he asked 16-year-old Pat Conroy, what would you do to make this poem better? Literature can always be improved. Can you imagine that? You're a 16-year-old kid from a small town nobody's ever heard of, and the most famous writer in your state is talking to you peer-to-peer, writer to writer, asking your opinion. Pat remembered mumbling out something about trying to make a stronger rhyme at the end. And I'd love to know if Archibald Rutledge actually took that advice. It was a beautiful moment either way. On the ride back home, Jean Norris asked Pat, what did you learn today? Which is something teachers and parents are always asking students, something I asked my own student quite a bit as well. And Pat, trying to be a good student, started to parrot back all the things that Rutledge said, and Jean stopped him, cut him off, and said, no, that's not what you learned. You learned how a writer treats another writer. Archibald Rutledge just showed you how a famous writer treats a no-account, snot-nosed kid who has the same dreams and ambitions he once had. And Pat remembered saying to Gene Norris, his teacher, in that car, "If I ever get to be a writer, I'll be nice to every kid I meet." It's a big, bold statement to make, but it's something of an oath that I think Pat Conroy actually lived up to in many ways, not just every kid he met, but every writer he met. I can certainly attest to that in my own experience. Gene also introduced Pat to the first novelist he ever met. Gene realized that Pat Conroy and 6 or so other kids at Beaufort High School had a remarkable capacity for creative writing. And Gene was primarily a teacher of literature, not of writing. So he recruited a local writer, a woman named Ann Head, to be a creative writing teacher as a volunteer at Beaufort High School. And Ann became a remarkable mentor to Pat as well, above and beyond her time with Pat at Beaufort High School. We'll circle back around her in just a second. So after graduating from Beaufort High, Pat goes to the Citadel on a basketball scholarship he would not have been able to attend otherwise. We flip this around to our Citadel wall here. There's Mr. Conroy's Citadel cap down there, and quite a lot of Citadel material. There he meets another really wonderful mentor, this guy. This is Colonel Corvasi, the Boo, and this particular portrait of the Boo was given to us by Pat's Citadel roommate, Mike DeVito. You can see it signed down here, signed by the Boo to Mike, who addressed it to the other who made Conroy possible, and then signed it to the Boo. I love that. At the Citadel, Pat still very much wanted to be a poet, and like Beaufort High, Citadel had a literary magazine, still has it to this day, in fact, the Shako. This is a poem that Pat wrote his knob year, his freshman year at the Citadel, which made him immediately famous on campus. Excuse me. Just 4 lines. "The dreams of youth are pleasant dreams of women, vintage, and the sea. Last night I dreamt I was a dog who found an upperclassman tree." Well, this makes Pat infamous on campus, but we don't have to imagine how the Citadel responded because Pat wrote about it in a letter to Ann Head, his creative writing teacher, and Ann's daughter, Nancy Thody, has shared this with me. So let me put this on screen for you. That's Ann, by the way, at the typewriter, Pat's teacher. And this is Pat writing to her. "The poems have been published, and one of them was nearly a preamble to my obituary. I was getting ready for noon formation when I looked toward my door. My roommate froze with fear. I was etched in doom. Milling out there were about 1 million, yes, 100 million members of the upper classes. It was a lynch mob, hatred shown round about them, and I feared exceedingly." And this is one of the upperclassmen. "Conroy, you not only found a tree, you found a forest. I was scared that day, Mrs. Morris, but the net result was they liked me a little better." And indeed they did. Pat made himself known. He made a bold move publishing that poem, first of many poems that Pat would publish in the Shako during his years at the Citadel. And by his senior year, he would once again be captain and MVP of the basketball team. There he is, and once again an editor for the literary magazine, just as he had been in high school. Well, Pat returns from the Citadel, comes back to Beaufort, where Gene Norris helps him get a job teaching at Beaufort High School. And Pat teaches at Beaufort High for 2 years before he goes out to Defusky. He is teaching government and psychology. Let me see if I can get him behind. There he is over my shoulder there in the classroom at Beaufort High. In his first year, he's teaching government and psychology, and he's teaching psychology very much in the same way. His mother read Gone with the Wind to him as a series of stories. There seems to be no psychological condition that Pat has to teach his students about, but he cannot somehow equate to a family member who just happens to have that particular condition. So Pat teaches psychology as a series of stories. He also introduced sex education to Beaufort High School at a time when small town Beaufort was perhaps not ready for that. But there was a problem with teen pregnancy, and Pat decided he would address it by introducing human sexuality as a topic into his psychology class. And teen pregnancy rates at Beaufort High actually dropped. Something about hearing sex described by Pat Conroy made teenagers want nothing whatsoever to do with it. It was a very successful technique. In his second year teaching at Beaufort High, he was able to do something else very remarkable as well. School was not yet integrated, although that was coming, but through a program called Freedom of Choice, for about 100 African-American students on campus. And after the assassination of Dr. King, some of them approached Pat, the young liberal school teacher that he was, and asked him about being faculty sponsor for the Afro-American Culture Club student organization, which Pat readily agreed to do. In addition to that, Pat wanted to introduce this subject into the curriculum. So he created what may have been the first African-American studies class taught in any public school in the state of South Carolina. And I've gotten to talk to both Black and white students from that class, and they describe how remarkable it was. Pat was learning to teach it while he was teaching it, and they were learning to study it while Pat was teaching it. So it really was a shared experience for all of them. After his 2 years at Beaufort High School, population in Beaufort is changing, and Pat's year-to-year contract was not going to be renewed. There wasn't a need for as many classroom teachers in Beaufort High. And that's when Pat had the opportunity to go out to Defusky Island. He was actually thinking about going into the Peace Corps, and then realized he could have a Peace Corps-like experience without even leaving Beaufort County. This is the 1969-1970 school year, and you can see some Defusky photos by Billy and Paul Kaiserling behind me there. Pat went out there as not only the first white school teacher to ever be on the island, but the first male school teacher as well. He had 18 students, grades 5 through 8, and no experience whatsoever teaching students that young. He had to make it up as he went along, very much like we do here at the Conroy Center, very much in that same spirit. He realized early that these kids were not going to have a future on the island for the most part. They were not going to live the same lives that the parents lived. So he dedicated himself not only to teaching what was required by the school district, but teaching them about the world beyond the island as well. Many of them had never been off the island. They did not know the name of the Atlantic Ocean, even though that's the body of water that washes up on their beach. Some of them thought that Savannah was the largest city in the world because it's the only city they had ever heard of. Through no fault of their own, they had been denied a level of education equal to their white counterparts. In the end, Conroy not only gives them equal education, but in many ways, education superior to their white counterparts by introducing them to so many ideas, so many big concepts above and beyond what the district required. He also wanted them to see the world. Pat was a big believer in experiential learning. So he brought them off the island into town to go trick-or-treating. They were very familiar with Halloween, but houses were so far apart on Defusky, nobody really went trick-or-treating. Here in the historic district, they were able to do that. And word started getting back to the school superintendent and the school board that young liberal Pat Conroy out on the island was bringing the kids into town, into the historic district, therefore the white district. Pat also wanted them to know as much as possible about this country. So he took them to Washington, D.C., where Pat and his family had actually lived the year before they came to Beaufort. He took them on a trip to go to all the major monuments and the Smithsonian Institute in D.C., something that you didn't get to do in Beaufort until you were a high school student. That's where Pat went on his senior trip at Beaufort High School. So at that point, he really was giving the kids a superior education to their white counterparts. And that also did not go over well with the school board and school superintendent. Let me show you a couple things in this case, and I will tell you what you already know, how this particular story ends. Mr. Conroy is fired from teaching on Defusky Island. He sues for wrongful termination, and that court case becomes a national news story. There are reporters down here in tiny little Beaufort from the Washington Post and the New York Times covering the trial. And many of them are telling Pat that this is a story bigger than a news article. He needs to write a book about this. And Pat was always thinking he would write something on that scale about his Defusky experience, but now the fuse is really lit to write the book that becomes The Water is Wide when Pat loses that trial. What we're looking at in this case is an excerpt from The Water is Wide that appeared in Time Life magazine, along with those photographs from the Kaiserling brothers as well. And here's a photo of Pat teaching on the island. This is a gift from Sally Ann Robinson, one of those students, arguably the most famous of them. Sally Ann is one of 4 of Pat's students from Defusky Island who went on to become a teacher herself, although she's been many other things since then as well. Let me see if I've got Sally Ann for you here. There we are. There she is. This is Sally Ann featured in O magazine, Oprah Winfrey's magazine, just a couple of months ago on Defusky Island. She's recently moved back to the island. She is a celebrity chef, the author of 4 cookbooks, co-author of a short history of Defusky Island. She works with us here at the Conroy Center quite a bit. And she also owns her own tour company. And it's a really wonderful experience to go out to Defusky, spend a day with Sally Ann. She's a great friend to us here at the center. So after Pat Conroy loses his trial, he writes The Water is Wide, and his path is set to be a professional writer from that point onward. And that's really the focus of this last room up front here in the Interpretive Center. This is our recreation of Pat's office. This is where so much of the magic happened. Let me show you a couple of things in here. This is our portrait of Pat Conroy, done by portrait artist Susan Graber, who makes her home here in Beaufort. She's married to Scott Graber, who was one of Pat's Citadel classmates. And Susan and Scott stopped by the other day with their son, Zach. It was Zach's very first time to see this portrait. Really wonderful experience to get to share with them. Over here on this wall, we have quite a lot of photos from Pat's time as a writer, some really wonderful portraits and news stories as well. But let's shift our focus back over here to the desk. And once again, that's the Beaufort River. You can kind of see out the window there through the blinds. This is a desk that Pat had on his Fripp Island home. So about half of Pat's books, really from Beach Music onward, would have been written, at least in part, at this desk. Always longhand, always on yellow legal pads, very much like we have it set up here to this day. We have a couple of interesting artifacts on the desk that I'll show you. Let's stop here first. Here's a photo of the desk and actually this same chair, also as seen on the Fripp Island house. And you can see a globe up front there. That is this, Pat's MVP trophy from his senior year at the Citadel, the inspiration for what will eventually become Pat's book, My Losing Season. We also have another wonderful artifact here that Pat always kept near his desk, not on it as we have it, but near. This is a letter from James Dickey, who Pat mentioned in his letter of support for me, which I read to y'all earlier. This is the letter that Dickey sent when he gave Pat permission to audit a poetry class. This is fall of 1972. This is just before The Water is Wide comes out. And Pat is still trying to figure out if he's going to be a writer of poetry or prose. He was absolutely enamored with the writing of James Dickey, audited that class, and realized he could never become a poet in the same way that James Dickey was a poet. But it starts Pat to thinking about what he can do with his love of poetry and prose. And it leads him to start writing that beautiful lyrical prose that we all associate with his writing. It is this class in 72 with Dickey that sets Pat on the path to find the rhythm of his own language and stick with it, as he once said. We have also back here all of these wonderful books. Pat had about 8,000 books in his personal library spread out between two houses. He was in the habit of reading about 200 pages a day, something he started doing as a sophomore in high school, inspired by his English teacher at the time, Joseph Monti at Gonzaga High School in Washington, D.C. We certainly don't have all 8,000 here represented, but quite a few of them. Thankfully, this building, which was a former law office, had all these beautiful bookcases in it, and we are certainly making good use of them. You'll see them throughout the Conroy Center. I want to show you two other things quickly in here before we go down the hallway and look at a couple of rooms in progress. This is a piece that was made for our Conroy Center by a group of local students at Bluffton, one town over from where we are here in Beaufort. This is one of our donation boxes, a beautiful metal sculpture made by a welding class, the master fabricators. And that is the state of South Carolina. That's the base, two beautiful palmetto trees here coming up, and then a book on top, which the kids represented reading, writing, teaching, education in the big sense. And here we can see a couple of the kids in this photograph. Coincidentally, they all showed up dressed as Pat Conroy. If you ever saw Pat late in life, you will recognize that being more or less his uniform, khakis and t-shirt. And they delivered this donation box. It had a really weird metal jingle to it, and I thought perhaps it had become damaged when they transported it over. So I asked their teacher, Bradley Childress, who you see in the back of that photo there, about that. And he said, you know, the class meets after lunch, and since we got the box done, the kids have been putting their change into it. So those students delivered this donation box with a donation of coins already in it. Those coins are in it to this day, about 5 years later, just as a sort of good luck charm too. It's a really wonderful gift from them. Speaking of khaki pants, Kathy Murphy, you will certainly recognize this. I think you're out there in Zoom land with us. You know, there are about 75 writers' museums in the country, and I guarantee you go to any of the others, you're not going to see an autographed pair of the writer's pants on the wall. I don't think Faulkner House has this. I'm pretty sure Margaret Mitchell House doesn't either. This is a wonderful story behind it, though, and it speaks to the generosity of Pat Conroy, which inspires the generosity of so many of our donors, which makes all these wonderful things possible. Pat went to the Pulpwood Queen's Girlfriend weekend, a beautiful, wonderful book club convention in Jefferson, Texas in 2011. And he went with his daughter, Melissa, when her book, Poppy's Pants, came out. There's a poster for Poppy's Pants right down there. Got there and realized that all of the authors were supposed to bring a donation of some kind for a fundraiser for the Dolly Parton Imagination Library. And Pat had brought nothing, come unprepared. So in honor of Poppy's Pants, in honor of Melissa's book, he decided to donate a pair of his own pants, authenticated perhaps by that stain, just to make sure they're Pat Conroy's, which he signed. And these sold at auction for $1,000 to a writer named M.L. Malcolm. You can see her signature note right there. She turned around and gave them to Kathy Patrick, now Kathy Murphy, as a gift. Kathy had them put in this shadow box, which Kathy assures me cost her about $800. So now $1,800 have been spent on a pair of Pat Conroy's pants. Kathy and her friend Tawana Anderson Neal drove them across country to donate them to our Conroy Center. We are very happy to display them and share that story. Incidentally, the Pulpwood Queens still meet, still have that annual convention. 21 years old, I believe the organization is this year. But for the past couple of years, that fundraiser has been for us, for the Conroy Center, and it makes possible many of our free programs for our community. We have here in Beaufort a chapter of the Pulpwood Queens that had been meeting in person at our Conroy Center. And as we go down the hall, I will show you where they will resume meeting in person just as soon as that becomes possible again. So we're very glad for our many associations with the Pulpwood Queens. Let's make a quick stop in our gift shop here. It's a really beautiful space. It's come together so nicely. We have all of the books available by Pat Conroy, by family members, books about Pat, and quite a few books by our local authors, including many of our volunteers who are writers, and books by presenters and visiting instructors who work with us here at the center as well, and a growing number of children's books and fun non-book items over there as well. So let's take a walk down the hall. Gift shop continues into these beautiful bookcases right here. There is Cassandra King Conroy's Tell Me a Story. The future home of our children's art wall right here. And another interactive part of our center. This is a bookcase and message board made by Cassandra King Conroy's son, Jason. And it's taken on a really wonderful life above and beyond anything we might have envisioned for it when it first arrived. All sorts of messages are left for Pat, for us at the Conroy Center. It's a really sweet message from Pat's daughter, Jessica, right there. And see if I can find it. There it is, from brother Tim Conroy, right there as well. So really wonderful to see this thing filled up with so many notes from so many visitors. This is our Cassandra King Conroy room. If you were with us yesterday, you saw Holland Perryman present from in here. Very much a work in progress right now, but a wonderful little reading lounge. There is a beautiful portrait of Cassandra there, one of Pat Conroy here. They're both made by the same artist. His name's Anthony Johnson. He was 16 years old when he did this portrait of Pat Conroy. And let's see if we can do that. There he is. There's Anthony. This portrait is done in a style of artwork called journal art. And if I get right up on it, you can see the shape of words and letters. So this is not just a drawing, this is writing. What Anthony did was read The Water is Wide as a 16-year-old African-American student newly arrived in the Low Country. He was so moved by that this portrait is done with quotations from that book and Anthony's stream of consciousness response to reading that. More recently, I think he was 19 when he did this portrait of Cassandra. His style has gotten a little more sophisticated, so it's a little easier to read what's on here. And we're very happy to have both of these. Incidentally, both of these were made possible by gifts from donors at our Conroy Center. So let's go back out here to the hallway just a second. You can see all the way down the hallway this beautiful view out the river. So it's nice that you can actually see it from the far end of the hallway as well. So we've seen our Cassandra Conroy room. We've got some movie posters here. Work in progress over here at the Ann River Siddons room, which we won't go into because there's a lot going on in there. But that will eventually be a sort of writer's retreat room where we have a desk and some chairs and a quiet space for visitors and volunteers to use. We're about to enter our education room, and this is the room from which Holland and I have been producing March 4th, and we'll be in here a little later today as well. This is a space that we did not have in the earlier incarnations of the Conroy Center. Very much an adaptable space, classroom for our workshops, for our book club groups. There are other organizations here in Beaufort that we are partners with that will be meeting in this space as well. We have all sorts of tables and chairs. Can configure this room into whatever is needed, and many things are needed. But this has been our sort of production suite for March 4th this weekend. We're now looking at a familiar member of our Conroy Center staff to some of you. This is Honey the bear. His identical cousin, Foggy, was our mascot to Camp Conroy this year. And this, before we get to Camp Conroy, let's have a quick look at that. This is a beautiful portrait of that was donated by a local artist named Candace Lovely, and she's very kind to make it available to us here. You'll be seeing it as the backdrop in the next session this afternoon. But Camp Conroy, one of our signature programs, is, excuse me, a couple of years old now. This began originally just as a very small group of 12 kids being taught by 3 instructors over the course of 2 weeks, which those kids spent reading, writing, illustrating, designing, and ultimately publishing a 32-page children's book together. The second year that we did it, we went from having 12 students to having 30 students, really remarkable growth in a short period of time, with many of those kids being able to join the camp by virtue of scholarships. And we're looking at the artwork and the writing of one of those students from the 2019 camp. Last year in 2020, it was not possible to hold the camp in person as well, so it became a virtual program, very much like the one we're having right now. We had a dozen campers that year, but from all over the country, 5 states, 3 time zones. And this is the book that they produced together. It's called Stretching Skyward, and you can see Melissa Conroy's artwork in there as well, something the kids worked on. Once again, all of the students were able to create a couple of pieces of artwork and couple of written pieces as well, many of them being published for the first time in our Camp Conroy anthology. It's a wonderful program, and I look forward to doing it again this summer. So I'm looking at my clock. We're about to run out of time, gang. I do want to share one last story with you, and then we'll try and do a Q&A. I will be able to see your questions, and I will to read them and answer them for you through the chat. But if you do have questions about our Conroy Center, or about, oops, flip that around, any of the programs I've mentioned, even in brief, I'd be happy to answer those. We'll try and stay on a little bit longer than we had intended, since we've got a little bit of time before the next session. But I want to share with you a letter. It's a letter that I always like to end these tours and many of my lectures with as well, because I think it speaks so clearly to Pat Conroy's own legacy as a mentor, as a teacher, and very much to the spirit of what we do here at the Conroy Center. It's a letter we got from Pat, almost beyond the grave, as I like to say. It's a letter that was shared with us in October of 2016, several months after Pat Conroy had passed away. In March of 16, it's a letter that Pat wrote in 1968 to his Beaufort High School principal, Bill Dufford. Dr. Dufford was very much like Gene Norris and Ann Head, a really central figure in the young life of Pat Conroy, and he became a lifelong friend and lifelong mentor to Pat as well. Incidentally, Dr. Dufford, still alive, 94 this year, I believe, still actively involved in education in his hometown of Newberry, South Carolina, and really a wonderful friend to us here at the Conroy Center, one of the sponsors for Camp Conroy, and occasionally shows up here in Beaufort and spends an hour or so telling me everything I'm doing wrong with my life. And I treasure those conversations. He's a wise, funny, friendly man. But in 1968, after Pat's first year of teaching at Beaufort High, he wrote a letter to much younger Bill Dufford, thanking him for inspiring Pat to become a teacher. That letter was written and read in 1968. Nobody saw it again until October of 2016, when a historian, Tracy Powers, found it in Bill Dufford's archive at Newberry College, shared it with Bill, who in turn shared it with so many of us. And I want to read to you and put on screen the last little bit, excuse me, of that letter. There it is. Again, this is Pat Conroy, 1968. He was 23 years old. I've never understood the dynamics of hero worship. Maybe it was the discovery of a father I never had as a youth and finally found in you. A father who was not only stern, but tender, a father of both the storm and the sun. It is important for you to know this effect you have had, and I believe you know it. But in the shortness and horrible brevity of life, I want to get everything said, everything. Someday I'll exert the same influence over someone, and I want him to tell me, this is immortality. For what I've learned from you, I will pass on, and it will be passed on, and it will be passed on, and passed on. It's beautiful, heartfelt sentiment from a young teacher to his own mentor. And that last line is in so many ways effectively the mission statement of our nonprofit Conroy Center. That's what we've been doing through the magic of Zoom and this tour in the last hour. I've taken some of the lessons that Pat Conroy learned from his teachers and his mentors and shared with his students, including me and his readers. And I've shared them with you in the hopes that you will now take custody of them and see that they're passed on and passed on and passed on. And it's a great honor for me to get to do that in the memory of Pat Conroy, who was so important to my own life. Pat always told me that I would be a teacher and a writer at some point, and I told him I didn't think I had anything to teach or anything to write. 5 years after Mr. Conroy's death, that is very much who I am, teacher and writer. So his predictions were very much true for me. And what a wonderful discovery to make. What a wonderful place we have here in Beaufort for other writers to get to discover who they are meant to be as well, writers of all ages and visitors of all ages from all over the country. So I want to thank you all for joining me here in our tour. I think we've got a couple of questions in the chat, and I'll try and answer them with the last few minutes that we have. Caroline is asking, excuse me, I may have missed it, but is this space rented or owned? In other words, have you found a final home for the Conroy Center? So a wonderful question. Yes, this purchase of this building was made possible by the generosity of many people, both large gifts and small gifts alike. And fundraising for the building is ongoing. If you go all the way back up to the top of the chat, you'll see a note from us about that, or you can simply go to patconroyliterarycenter.org to learn more about how you can give, not only in support of this building, but of our year-round educational mission as well. And we're so grateful to everybody who has been able to give in honor of that. Some wonderful notes from Kathy Murphy, founder of the Pulpwood Queens out there. Yes, Kathy said I made her cry. Yeah, I have this, whenever I give a presentation, it seems to be about 1 in 5 people cry. And very often I'm one of the 1 in 5. Barely made it through this one without crying, but yes, Kathy, thanks again for donating the pants, and more importantly, the story that goes with the pants, and for supporting our Conroy Center with the annual gift from the Pulpwood Queens. All of that means so much to us. Let's see, we are nearing the end of our time here. Hey, Joe Palmer. Yes, Joe is commenting on my losing season as well. You know, Joe, and he says that he considers it one of his best books. My absolute favorite Pat Conroy scene is in that book. I wouldn't describe it as my favorite book, but there is a moment where Pat Conroy, real Pat Conroy, interacts with a fictional protagonist from My Losing Season, Will McLean. Pat, the author, is trying to get to a memory of a basketball game, a real memory of a real basketball game, and he realizes he's already used it as the inspiration for a fictional basketball game in Lords of Discipline. So it's a moment that is metafictional, which is probably not a word that Pat knew at the time, in which the creator of Will McLean gets to talk to the fictional character of Will McLean. It is a beautiful scene, maybe a page and a half long, but I absolutely love that moment in that book. Really wonderful chapter about Joseph Monty as well, who was Pat's English teacher at Gonzaga High School. Pat often described him as the first great teacher of his life, and Pat certainly had many great teachers here at Beaufort High as well. Joe Monty, incidentally, has been to see us a couple of times. I think he's 85 or 86 this year, still actively involved in teaching Sunday school and as a member of his local teachers union, and also one of our donors here at the Conroy Center. He's become a great friend and mentor to me in many ways. Very much the same spirit that Bill Delford had. Thank you, Will. Thank you, Charlene. I'm getting some very kind notes from volunteers and other March 4th presenters as well. I appreciate you all being here with us. We have an international group of audience members from March 4th, presumably for the first time. We've had folks come from many states for most of the years that we've been doing this, but because it's virtual this year, we actually have folks from beyond the United States watching as well. And I'm so happy to see that. We've found that to be true for quite a few of our programs now that they're in virtual format. Thank you, Dana. Another nice comment in there. All right, gang, if there are no other questions y'all want to throw into our chat, we're at 1:30 right now, so you will get a Zoom link reminder, if you haven't already, about our 2 o'clock session, which I very much encourage you to sign on for. That is Drew Lanham, longtime presenter for March 4th. This is his 4th appearance, and this is our 5th March 4th. So he's been with us every year except one, appearing this year with his own mentor, another great circling back around the idea of mentorship, John Lane. And Ellen Malfris will be moderating that session. As I mentioned at the start of our time here, Cassandra King Conroy is going to make a little on-camera cameo appearance at the start of that session as well. So thank you all for being with us. I really appreciate your time. I hope you get to see our new center in person as soon as that is safely possible. We will reopen to the public this coming Thursday, which is March 11th. The day before my birthday, if that gives you any ideas, folks. And we'll be open Thursday through Sunday, noon to 4 p.m. Many thanks once again to all of our volunteers and docents who give their own version of this tour in really wonderful ways as well. Thank you all for joining us. Take care.